Yeah, we're in Acts chapter 27.
Yeah.
Acts 27.
We're getting there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're nearly there, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be a good one. Yeah. We're in Acts chapter 27 and Paul's going to be on his way to Rome. You know, this is what this big saga has been, isn't it? All the way from Jerusalem on to Rome. So this chapter in a way, as I say, it's like a story that we can read through. I'll go through it and then we'll have a chat about it when we've gone through it, okay? So Acts chapter 27. Paul is going to set sail for Rome. He's on his way. And Rome is the great capital of the Roman Empire, obviously. And, you know, sometimes it's good just to think of what the Roman Empire was all about. It was massive. It was really the capital of the then known world in many ways. And there was a lot there. Rome had encompassed so many other, the Greek, their culture had been absorbed into the Roman Empire. They were free to practice and carry on the way they'd always lived. Their language was still accepted. The Jewish religion was still accepted. You know, the barbarians found a place within the Roman Empire. The Romans had built huge roads and buildings all over the empire. They say all roads lead to Rome. And when you got to Rome itself, you know, it was a huge place. There was the circuses, you know, not just with clowns and that, but, you know, where all the sports and different things took place. And there was the monuments and so many other things, you know, the temples. It was a thriving, huge place, Rome. And you can understand why Paul wanted to go there. There were already a small number of Christians in Rome, but you imagine what a thriving evangelical church in the middle of a place like that would be able to do. And Paul had this desire to go to Rome for a long time. And we see he's now on his way, you know. It's an incredible place to go to. At the same time, Rome was a place full of terrible stuff as well. You read Romans chapter 1, and I'm sure that Paul gets a lot of his thoughts as he writes that letter in Romans, that, you know, what the things he sees and he knows are going on in Rome, the sort of things that he mentions, you know, about the fallenness of mankind as well, because it's all there evident in Rome. So, you know, you just imagine you going there, you know, the things you'd see. It was a place where everything was happening and everything was going on. Probably like we might think a big city today, like London or something like, you know, everything's happening there. We live out in the countryside. But if you lived in the outskirts of the empire and you hear of Rome, it would be the place to go with everything going on. So we get to verse 1. And it says in verse 1, and when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, and look, Luke is using the we, okay? He's writing this, he's telling the story, and obviously Luke is going with Paul, so he's in the plural, that we should sail to Italy. They delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment, okay? So there's Paul and there's some other prisoners, right? And sometimes prisoners were sent to Rome because, like Paul, they were Roman citizens. They may have appealed to Caesar, but they were going to go to Rome for trial. But other prisoners could be sent to Rome because they're convicted criminals and they're going to go to the circuses and they're going to be entertainment. They'll be put to death, but it'll be entertainment for the crowds. And we've probably all heard about that in the days of the Roman Empire, how they amused themselves watching people being maybe thrown to the wild animals or, you know, cut to pieces by gladiators, or they had to fight gladiators where they got no hope of winning. But there would be some sort of rather grisly entertainment for the crowds there in Rome. And so, you know, these other prisoners are going up and they're under the guard of Julius, the centurion of the Augustan regiment. Now we look, it says the ship, so entering a ship of Andromitium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us, or Thessalonica was with us. And in Acts 19:29, I don't know if you've got a little note in your Bibles there, but we came across him before in Acts 19:29. And he was one of the ones, I think, who was arrested with Paul, wasn't he? Or arrested it. I remember that story. Acts 19:29. Oh yes, now when they were full of this, when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. That's that story there. So the whole city was filled with confusion, and they rushed into the theatre of one accord, having seen Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travelling companions. So this is the same chap that looks like he, again, is travelling with Paul and Luke, and they're on their way to Rome. They're travelling up there together. And it says in verse 3, and the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, that's the centurion, treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. Now, Paul's a prisoner. I don't know whether he went on trust or he went, under guard of some soldiers, but he was given the ability to go and visit some friends and receive care, or maybe some hospitality. We don't know what the care actually means, but it's quite strange that this Roman centurion, a hardened soldier, would have so much sort of empathy with Paul, isn't it? But he seems to be, prepared to give him a certain amount of liberty and to allow him to go and do that. So it says in verses 4 to 8, when we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary, they were against them. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, the city of Lycia. And there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. And when we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. Passing up with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. I don't know whether you've got a map in your Bible or not, but you can probably find that map of Paul's travels. You can see they sailed up north from sort of where he started off, and then they cut across towards the west, and they start moving westward on that boat. And they're starting off at a time of year when really, it's a strange time of year really to start sailing in the eastern side of the Mediterranean, because storms can blow up there, and they've got contrary weather anyhow. And it says in verse 9, now when much of the time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was already over. That fast, I think, is the Day of Atonement. I should think it's the Feast of Atonement. That's the one they're talking about. So it was late in the year. Have you got some maps?
Some haven't, some haven't.
No, some haven't, some haven't. Oh, well. We'll have a little look later on.
Yeah.
We can have a rummage. I've got a map in my Bible I can show you. Yeah.
Where do they sail from?
They start off to Jerusalem, don't they? Or,
Oh, they're from Rome, aren't they?
yeah, they're going up there, yeah. You see, they sail up north. So they arrive in this city of Lasea, okay? Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because of the time of year, because the feast was already over, as I say, that's atonement. And they reckoned in this year that Paul sailed up there, the Feast of Atonement was around about October time, end of October. And so they're reaching November, which is a time of year when it is unpredictable on the east side of the Mediterranean. Paul advised them. He says, men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. He's telling them, he warns them, it's dangerous and not a good idea to sail. It's going to be extremely dangerous. But look, verse 11. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman, I don't know whether you want to call the helmsman the pilot or the captain of the ship maybe, and the owner of the ship, than by the things spoken by Paul. And I suppose time is money in business. Yeah, and so money speaks louder than words in a lot of ways, doesn't it? So he didn't want to have his boat just sitting there in port, not earning any money. So they overruled what Paul had to say, and they set sail. So verse 12, and because the harbour was not really suitable to winter in anyhow, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbour of Crete, opening towards the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So the harbour they were already in was exposed to the rough seas, and they were hoping to make a dash for it to the safety of a Cretan harbour, if they could get there. I think it was a harbour that ran, like it says there, from southwest to northwest. And they could shelter there, get the boat in there and ride out the rest of the winter maybe, or at least the stormy season. So that's what they do, they set off. Verse 13, it says there, so when the south wind blew softly, supposing they'd attained their desire, putting out to sea, they set sail to Crete. They get this gentle southerly breeze blow up, right? And they're deceived into thinking it's okay to sail. They're convinced, well, this will be all right. This will be our opportunity. Let's make a dash for it, thinking this would be a good thing to go out now. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called the Euroclydon. So the weather changed really quickly, and it's like a storm blows up from almost nowhere. And so when the ship was caught, they could not head into the wind, so they had to let her drive. In other words, they'd had to be carried along by the wind. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, should I say, we secured the skiff with difficulty. That's the little boat that they would tow along behind. And when they'd taken on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands. They struck sail, so they were driven. So the little boat that they towed along, like the lifeboat behind them, this little boat for security, they pull that on board, they secure that on the deck, and then they run cables underneath the boat, ropes under the boat to make sure the hull doesn't split apart. They're taking every little bit of precaution they can because they're in such stormy situations. They also sometimes used to run one from the bow to the stern of the boat to stop it sort of splitting in half when it went up on the waves high. It doesn't actually mention that there, does it? But they undergirded it with straps really to stop the planks splitting out and the boat just, taking on board a lot of water. In verses 14 and 15, it says, not long after a tempest. So, in verse 15, again, Luke says, we let her drive. So it almost sounds like Luke had to join in with the rest of the hands. He was there sort of working to try and make sure the boat, was safe. Everybody on board was playing their part. You couldn't just sit around and watch the sailors do it. Everybody had to muck in and get their hands dirty, and try and keep the ship safe. And again in verse 15 it says, look, we let her drive. In verse 15, we just had to let the ship get on with it, really. We let her be driven by the wind. So I think everybody on board was taking part in what had happened, in making sure that they did their best. That once the ship was blown away from Crete, they were in the open sea. We read that there, and it was being blown up and down, right, on the open sea. And the sailors, they do 5 things to try and save the situation. And in verses 16 and 17, like I say, they secured the ship's lifeboat on the deck, and they passed ropes under the ships to hold it together. They lower the sails, so they're just blown about the wind. They're probably dragging a sea anchor behind them to slow things down. In verse 18, look, they dumped the cargo. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. They throw the cargo overboard. That's the whole point of the journey, wasn't it? To get the cargo. And that was where the captain would sell the cargo and make the money. That was what you do, trade. Verse 19, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. We did that with our own hands. That's the equipment, the ropes, the pulleys. It's all expensive stuff. It's all handmade, all thrown into the sea. Any other bits of equipment they didn't need, they throw into the sea to make the ship a little bit lighter. In verse 20, look, it says, now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we should be saved was finally given up. In other words, they gave up. They come to the end of their tether. This is it. We haven't got anything else we can do. We're not going to get out of this. All's lost, They gave up, finally gave up. They gave up hope of being saved, gave up hope of getting to dry land. So, if you think about it in Acts so far, right, Paul has always sort of been, in a way, he's been in a preeminent position. When he was persecuting the church, he was there, he was in control, he was a leader of that. Then when he became an apostle, he was sort of in control of his situation. He was doing what God had called him to do. He'd got his purpose there, whether persecutor or apostle. Even as a prisoner, he seems to have spoken out. But now they're on this ship, and everybody's in exactly the same position. He's just one of a number of just over 270 men on the boat. And they're all really, doing their best to save their own lives, aren't they? But he still stands with some authority on this boat. Paul still has a certain amount of authority on the boat. If you just read through it, if you look through here, what we've got. So they've dumped everything overboard, and they've done all they can. And as I said, they've just sort of think everything's gone for Burton now. But in verse 21, look, Now, don't forget, the last time Paul spoke up was before they left harbour, and he said, I don't think we should sail, it'd be too dangerous, verses 9 and 10. He was ignored, wasn't he? But look, verse 21. But after a long abstinence from food, in other words, I don't think they had time to eat. You know, they'd been too worried. It's not that they were on a fast, I don't think. I just think they hadn't had time to eat. And food hadn't been, maybe there's no way of preparing food or getting their hands on it. Then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss, right? He stands up and says that, right? Was he winding them up, do you think? Was he being honest? I think reminding them that he was right the last time he gave them a warning, and this time he's right again. He's going to be right again. Heed my words. Listen to what I've got to say this time, okay? He said, the fact you ignored me last time, you've incurred this disaster and loss, right? He says, now take courage, take heart, you know, don't give up, right? There will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And he speaks with confidence, and Paul is very confident. And why is that? Because if we go into verses 23, 24 and 25, we see why. Look, he says in verse 20, for there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and to whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. Right? In other words, all your lives will be spared. God's going to watch over us. He wants me to get to Rome, and in doing so he's going to make sure that each one of you is safe as well. Take heart. Don't be discouraged. You know, keep your spirits up. However, we must run aground on a certain island. In other words, the ship is going to be lost. Verse 26. The ship's going to be lost, but everybody else will be saved on it. And Paul is confident of this. He's confident because he's been told this by an angel of God. God has spoken to him. That's what he's really saying. It says, 2 weeks, or on the 14th night, when that had come, as we were driven up and down the Adriatic Sea, it means the wind, it looks like the wind's blowing one way and then the other. About midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. How would they sense that? The only way I can think is possibly they could hear the breakers crashing on the beach. You know, they'd hear the waves crashing on the beach, and they would, you know, hear the extra noise, and so they would know they were a little bit nearer land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they'd gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. In other words, they let the line over the side of the boat, see how far the weight sinks, pulls it up, measure it off, and find that they're getting to more shallow water. Then 29, then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern. In other words, maybe they were big stone anchors or whatever. They let them over the back of the boat, all at the stern, so that they could hang on the seabed, and that would stop the boat being driven forward towards the reefs and the beach, because it was pitch black and they didn't know what was happening. So the anchors hopefully would hold until morning. In verse 29 there. Right, and then it says in verse 30, and as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, in other words, the sailors want to jump ship, they want to get away. When they had let down the skiff or the lifeboat into the sea, they were pretending they were putting in anchors out from the prow. They pretended they were going to be, you know, doing more work to keep the boat safe. But Paul knew they were going to get in the skiff and they were going to depart from the ship and leave everybody else to get on with it. He says to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you can't be saved. It's all of us or none of us. Keep them all together. So the centurion calls them back on. Look, then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off the boat. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, today is the 14th day. You have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. You need to eat, get your strength up. That reminded me of what we've been talking about with Jonathan eating the honeycomb when the Israelite soldiers chased the Philistines. They ran out of energy because they hadn't eaten, and when Jonathan ate a little bit, he was refreshed. And these sailors need to do the same thing. They need to eat to get some strength up. Therefore I urge you, he says in verse 34, to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any one of you. You're all in God's hands. Each one of you, all in God's hands. He's going to watch over all of you, right? And not one of you will be lost. And now it seems to me, as you look at this, that Paul really is one giving the orders on the boat. How is that, how has he been allowed to have so much of a say on the boat? We don't hear of the captain saying much. We don't hear much of the centurion saying much. But Paul seems to be the one giving the instructions of what's going to happen. Somehow they recognise that Paul has an authority. It's a God-given authority, isn't it? And he is the one who's, instructing people what to do. And then look what he does in verse 35. And when he had said these things, he took bread and he gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. He's got such confidence and assurance that he breaks the bread. It's not a communion service. They weren't doing that, but they were sharing a meal. He was breaking the bread and he was thanking God for the food and thanking God for watching over them. And I believe he was thanking God for the promise that they would all get on the beach. But he actually began to eat. They broke bread. They had a meal. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. They saw Paul's example and they followed his example. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. And Paul was really telling everybody what to do. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. They dumped the rest of the cargo. That's an expensive thing to do, isn't it? But probably, they valued their lives more than the cargo. So they threw it all in the sea. And when it was day, they did not recognise the land, but they observed the bay with the beach, onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. Verse 39. They don't know where they are. But there was Malta. We'll see that a little later on. And there is a site in Malta called St. Paul's Bay. And if you read the descriptions we've got in this chapter, not just here, but all through this chapter, of the rocks, the sandbars and how it was, it's probably right that St. Paul's Bay is the bay where they ran aground. And the name has probably stuck with it ever since, really. But they came up onto this beach. They're at Malta, and they plan to run the ship aground. And they let go or cut off the sea anchors and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, they loosed the rudder ropes, so they cut them as well. They put up the mainsail and they headed to the wind and just steered towards shore the best they could using the sail. But they struck a place where the two seas met. In other words, there's probably a sandbar there where the two seas met and stirred up the sand and dumped it on the bottom. They ran the ship aground and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern, which was poking out to sea, was being broken up by the violence of the waves. So the ship was being smashed up. And that's a dangerous situation to be in, with bits of wood flying around, the waves coming in. Not is it dangerous, it's pretty terrifying, I'd have thought. And this is the situation they all find themselves in. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. Because if a soldier lost his prisoner, then the soldier had to pay or do whatever the penalty was that the prisoner would have done. So if the prisoner was going to appear and be killed by the wild animals in the circus, then the soldiers who lost them, they'd have to take their place and they would be killed by the wild animals in the circus. If the prisoner was going to be put to death, if the soldier lost his prisoner, the soldier would be put to death. So rather than lose their prisoners, they wanted to kill them. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was, they all escaped safely to land. And the rest of the real part of the story comes from it. But we see there, we've got a whole chapter of this description of this escapade of the first part of Paul's journey to Rome. And God is in control of all of it. And I don't know whether it sort of crossed your mind, but if God wants Paul in Rome, why didn't he give him a safe passage? Why didn't he just give him calm seas and let him sail there and get there quickly? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, but why should they go through all of this predicament when God wants Paul in Rome? Now that all the sagas in Jerusalem are behind them, just get to Jerusalem. But it's not worked. It hasn't worked out like that for a minute, has it?
No, because God wanted to display His greatness, His goodness, His miracles.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that no one died.
Nobody died.
As they obeyed His word. She is his word.
Yeah, that's right. As long as everybody, as you say, followed the word of the Lord, they did as Paul instructed them, as Paul had been instructed by the angel, everybody remained safe. If one person had to depart the ship, or a group had gone away, they'd have disobeyed, and we don't know what the outcome of that would have been. Well, we're going to talk about this a moment, so we'll see you friends at home a little later.